During this presentation, I will briefly tell you what's in ESCAP flagship report on economic and social issues in Asia Pacific. This report is written every year and tackles the most urgent policy challenges the region faces. So just a brief timeline note before we start. We usually prepare the report in the fourth quarter of every year and the first quarter of the following one. So this was between September and March 2021-22. So some parts of the macroeconomic outlook will be naturally a bit outdated, largely because of the ongoing crisis, the war in Ukraine. Nevertheless, there is a big part of the report, like most of the report, focuses on long-term trends on inequality. So the topic of inequality was chosen because of the pandemic, because we're observing the K-shaped recovery, and we're wondering what can be done to address these challenges now. And there is also another part which discusses how to tackle fiscal and how to shape fiscal and monetary policies during the crisis times, which were at that time were referring to the crisis we observed in 2020-21, but it stays same applicable to the events we're observing these days. So inequalities were rising actually already before the pandemic, and this was also coming in and out in the discussions on economic issues. But what happened during the pandemic is that we observed way more people being left behind. So this was also the spark which triggered to go beyond traditional thinking and look what can be done more given the resources the governments have. So let me now start first with the outlook of brief macroeconomic update on what happened during the pandemic and the short outlook we had at the time. And then we'll move to the discussion on fiscal policies, monetary policies, and on structural policies which shape inequalities in long term. So during the pandemic, the GDP growth in all the Asia Pacific region contracted just by 0.3%, although this was not equal within the region. So for example, for Southeast Asia, this has been estimated at minus 3.9. This relates to different structure of the economies, different exposure to exports and imports. But then we observed a strong rebound in following 2021. This rebound was driven largely by manufacturing and industrial production, as well as external demand. Nevertheless, even if the rebound was strong, then the total loss of GDP during the 2020 and 2021 was estimated a few months ago at around 2 trillion. These days, we should expect actually more, given the challenges related to the global fuel and food crisis and the rising in inflation. And as our outlook is usually more on the whole region, but there's still huge differences and discrepancies within the region, because the region is very diverse. Wherever you look, the economies are at different level of economic development. They have different structures. So for Southeast Asia, for example, the contraction in 2020 was pretty severe. If we look at East and Northeast Asia, the contraction was less severe and actually happened earlier, and the rebound was also a bit stronger. So we have to keep in mind that whenever we talk about regional economies, like, we should probably just stay focused on national economies. And for example, zooming in on just Southeast Asia, we can see that Philippines experienced severe recession in 2020, where neighboring almost Vietnam, the GDP growth stayed positive. So like, again, when we're thinking about the policies which will be presented later, we'll be discussing them in a context that they matter, where they're implemented, how they're implemented, and on the local national context. Regarding the inflation, which is now on most of the headlines, this was already a problem a few months back. So we've been observing the rise in commodity prices. The food prices were already a problem during the pandemic. This was pushed up by the shipping costs, currency depreciations, and of course, fiscal and monetary policies were very expansionary during the crisis in 2020 and 21, where the governments were aiming to boost the recovery. But on top of this, we cannot forget that we have the new shocks which happened this year, in particular the war in Ukraine and the rising food and oil prices. So regarding the outlook, this is what you can see here, this 5% more or less. This was still at the few months ago. These days, these outlooks are revised down, unfortunately. So we should not expect them being that strong. The inflation will remain certainly a problem for the foreseeable future. As long as the war will be going on, we should also not expect major probably changes. And given what these events, the scars on the macroeconomic stability will be very permanent, and they are still rising, which means that when we think about the policies which should decrease the inequalities, we should think about them how they will decrease them in the long term, because it won't be easy to recover from what happened. So why should we care about inequalities actually? Because inequalities has been there like almost always in the past. But moving towards the Agenda 2030 and trying to become more and develop and sustainable and fair in our economic development, we have to take into consideration what's happening to women, what's happening to youth and informal workers. So the previous model, how the economic development was done in the past was not always taking care about these groups. There are also many other vulnerable populations and groups in the society, but it's a time to tackle it in more macroeconomic way. And also, if this is not done these days, probably the recovery will way slower. So it's not only this human part, which we look at, more ethic part, but purely from the economic perspective, unless we decrease the inequalities, I will probably be expecting the economic growth in the future to be much slower. So regarding the impact of the pandemic, so if you are wondering what happened during the 2020 and 21 only, for Asia Pacific, the estimates suggest that around 85 million people were pushed back into extreme poverty. And this is the number at the extreme poverty level, so the lowest threshold. If we at purchasing power parity $1.9 per day, so if we raise it to 3.2, a bit more, or 5.5, we see that it's around 160 million which been pushed, and this doesn't include the events of the 2022. So addressing this gap, we found this the messages needs to flow down through fiscal policies, central banking, and structural transformation at the same time. As I will show later, none of these can be handled separately, and in times of crisis like this is a time to work on all possible policy fronts to tackle the inequalities and ensure that the recovery is faster and stronger and more sustainable. So let me now play you a short video which summarizes the messages from the survey, and then I will discuss in slides in a more detailed way what's happening and what do we observe and what are the policy options to consider to recover faster and stronger.
How do you feel, Grandma? We worry about you. Please tell us a story about your job as a TV reporter.
Well, it was many years ago.
Inequality is on the rise. Aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, it has taken away people's lives and dreams. Inflation and fuel prices, disproportionately affecting the poor. In Asia and the Pacific, the pandemic has doubled the multidimensional poverty level. An additional 85 million people could have been pushed back into extreme poverty, living on $1.9 per day or less. We need to take urgent action, but how? region is experiencing a highly uneven or so-called K-shaped recovery between countries and within countries. Building forward fairer, ensuring an inclusive recovery from the pandemic, and taking an inclusive development path is an imperative. Thank you, Mrs. Scap. So, how do we leave no one behind? We can't simply return to normal, can we? That normal is blamed for inequality in the first place.
Governments should prioritize spending on healthcare, education, and social protection.
Of course, but increasing spending is not a golden solution. We must spend smart to heal the long-term scars left by the pandemic.
We need to prioritize universal basic healthcare services over everything else. Children receiving high-quality education from their early years is our priority. We must shield people in need, vulnerable groups, and informal workers.
Tax fare should be the leading principle for obtaining budget revenues. Nobody and no company should avoid paying their share. Prevention is always better than cure. Before taxes and transfers, we must focus on pre-distributive policies. It's important that we set up countries for success through strong political systems that allow for checks and balances, strong institutional arrangements, and enough job-rich structural transformation that creates opportunities for all. Fast transformation and new technologies will be disruptive. Governments should act more proactively to guide their direction, shape their trajectory, and manage shocks for inclusive outcomes. Can central banks play a role in inclusive development? We can and we should. I believe it's time for us to step up our game and tackle Rise's inequality. Right now, only half of the central banks in the region are taking up an inclusive finance agenda, and it's such a missed opportunity. As policymakers, we can make the conduct of monetary policy more mindful about inequality. As investors, we can mobilize part of the $9.1 trillion official reserves in the Asia-Pacific region for social purposes. As currency issuers, we can explore how central bank digital currencies can foster financial inclusion. As financial regulators, we can encourage more use of innovative financial instruments for inclusive development. Thank you, colleagues. In looking ahead, the Asia-Pacific region must aim for inclusive recovery to promote the well-being of both people and the planet. Do you maybe have clear and ready-to-use guidelines to tackle inequality?
As a matter of fact, we do. Download the SCAP flagship publication. Follow our recommendations for building forward fairer.
And it worked, right? It worked, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Okay, welcome back. So we had a brief presentation was waiting for us. So let me start now with the fiscal policies discussion and the government's role in reducing inequality. And the main focus of this part will be that not all fiscal policies are basically equally designed and equally implemented. So that spending a certain amount of money on a certain policy does not bring equal results across countries, across the regions, especially in terms of inequality reduction. So these graphs show us how expenditure on education change inequality. So this is the Gini change on the y-axis. So all the bars are countries from the SCAP regions, and the dots are the rest countries in the world. So here we see what happens to inequality for every 1% of GDP spent on education. So this is a comparison of two scenarios. You can imagine we have one scenario where there is no spending on education, and there is another scenario where 3% of GDP is spent on education. So normalizing to 1%, we can see what's the impact and what's the change, what's the difference in the inequality between these two scenarios. So we see that in some countries, whatever they spend on education, it brings almost zero impact on inequality changes. And why can it happen? You can imagine that the education facilities are centered in the urban areas. They don't reach out to the rural areas. They don't reach out to the vulnerable populations, to the poorer people. So in this way, spending on education will actually not decrease the inequalities. And by contrast, there are some countries which handle this spending really well, but where spending on education for every 1% of GDP they commit to this policy, they have a very substantial decrease in inequalities. And this is also observed for other types of fiscal policies, namely for healthcare, where you can see in some countries actually spending on healthcare can increase inequalities. You can imagine that only people who have more money have access to hospitals, because there are some entry barriers, for instance, like the minimum personal spending. There are some countries where there is universal healthcare, where actually healthcare is available, at least at the basic level, for everyone. So spending in this way will substantially decrease the inequality. And the same true is for direct transfers or indirect subsidies, depending on where they are sent and how they are targeted, how efficient they are distributed. There will be different.
Everyone, good morning from Bangkok, from the UN Center. We have participants who are present in person, participants online, both from government.
Mr. Podolsky, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, I'm back. And the same is true for the revenue side of the fiscal policy. So depending how the taxes are collected, if there are personal income taxes which are progressive, or if this is a value-added tax or indirect taxes, these taxes can increase or decrease inequality. So coming from here, the first point is to take out from this presentation that policies have to be well targeted and designed to fit the local context. Second, let's think about more on where are we now following the crisis regarding our fiscal space. So regarding the revenues, the red bars, in 2020, from 2019 to 21, we've been observed that they're going down, while actually the fiscal expenditure went up. So this naturally has increased the fiscal deficits and increased our median debt to GDP levels, which we talked about later during the presentation. So regarding the fiscal balances, here we see what happened from 2019 is that the fiscal balances were actually not in bad shape, but 2020-21 has increased them dramatically. So having this macroeconomic, the fiscal situation where the fiscal space is really constrained, we should expect consolidations. And coming back to inequality and GDP growth, we did some research on what happened after fiscal consolidation periods were observed in Asia Pacific, what happened to inequality and what happened to GDP growth. So starting with inequality on the in the left figure, so our estimates suggest that every fiscal consolidation has basically a clear, is followed up by a clear increase in inequalities. You may think about, for the reasons thinking, you can think that there is less subsidies, there is less expenditure in education, less expenditure in healthcare. So all these fiscal policies which support people at the bottom of the economic pyramid, they're basically cut, which in long term, up to 5 years, leads the inequalities up. And regarding the GDP growth and basically recovery, there is also a clear sign that fiscal consolidations do decrease the future GDP growth. So having in mind that it matters how we spend or where we spend, and that the fiscal space is very limited and we're facing these consolidation times, so these three factors, we identified these three areas as one of the most important for long-term inequality changes, but as well as one of the most likely to be cut. So they are ones to be cut first. So looking at the regional expenditure on education, it's been already well below the world averages. So world average is the red dotted line, which we can observe here. And looking at South Asia, This is the continuous blue line, which is way below the world average. In the Philippines, it was hovering around 4% for the latest available data. So it's not only that we're starting from a point which is already below the world average, but it's very likely that there will be temptation to cut expenditures on these healthcare policies. Second, education. So regarding UNESCO guidelines, this is the green area here. UNESCO recommends to spend between 4 and 6% of GDP on education. And as for now, we've observed that the median spending in Asia Pacific was below these levels. So this is the red bars. The mean average was a bit higher, but it also depends on the region. In the Philippines, it was around 3%. So again, given remembering what was said before, that children in the region already are suffering a lot from school closures and have limited access to education, this is not an area where spending should be certainly cut down. Finally, social protection. So one of the reasons why we saw like 85 million people falling into extreme poverty in the region, or 160 at higher threshold levels, was the lack of social protection floors. This relates to what happened when people lose their work, when they get sick. In Southeast Asia, around 1/3 of population is covered by any sort of at least one social protection policy. For the whole Asia Pacific region, it's 46%. So looking at the research, we see that once people are not protected from falling into poverty, so means there is no this social protection floor, any sort of recovery takes more time, is more difficult, and it's less sustainable. So summing up this fiscal policy expenditure side, we come to the point that we need to spend smart, because the amount of resources are very limited. So regarding the healthcare, certainly universal health coverage should be the priority. Economies which had this universal health coverage before the pandemic and during experienced the less severe impact of the crisis, and also less severe impact on the pandemic. Send the education, especially the early level education, which has the most impact on the long-term inequalities and also impacts the performance, the secondary and tertiary levels. And finally, social protection. So universal basic social protection floors are the way forward. Second, it's not only about spending less or more, it's also about spending more efficient and less wasteful. So for healthcare, the World Health Organization estimates that sometimes up to 40% of resources are wasted. So instead of looking to increase for 5%, it's sometimes good time to look where can we improve our spending. And here the digital health technologies come with lots of help. So we observed how the pandemic changed the approach of the whole healthcare system to digital technologies. So online visits, online prescriptions, online registrations for hospital visits, for doctor visits, all these saves the money and increases the efficiency and the availability of the healthcare. Same for the education. The digital divide will be probably one of the expenditure areas where we see that without access to internet, children were left actually without any access to education for many years. And finally, for social protection, also digital technologies allow for immediate social transfers. They allow to have the register of people who are eligible for the benefits. They cut all the middlemen, all the structure which consumes the money which should be devoted actually to help people who need this help. Finally, let's move to the revenue side of the fiscal policies. So Asia Pacific itself, in the region, around 22% of GDP is collected through the various levels of taxes. This is actually relatively low, and given that having in mind Agenda 2030 and all the policies we're looking for, this must change. And where is the money actually being lost? So first is like tax avoidance, tax misinvoicing. So around 7.6% of tax revenue is lost just to the misinvoicing. In an informality of the economy. So companies, businesses, small enterprises Many of them are not registered, so do not pay any taxes. So aiming to increase these tax revenues, which are then shared back in the form of healthcare, education, informality has to be drastically reduced in the region. So taxing fair forward. So paying the fair share should be the main principle. Each company or each person who earns should pay accordingly to how they can. It doesn't mean that the taxation should be pushed down to the people who earn the least. No, usually it's still people who earn, or companies who have high profits due to this misinvoicing and other tax avoidance measures, or in total informality, they avoid the taxes, paying taxes where it would be possible. So expansion of the tax base, and finally shifting the tax burden from the low income to high income households. So let's look now for more root causes of the inequalities and look back how these things are shaped in the long term. So there is one of the hypotheses, the Kuznets hypothesis, that when the countries develop from a very low development level towards the higher ones, the inequality will rise. So you can imagine that you start from agrarian economy, which develops in the urban regions. So naturally, the people in the urban regions or the households will get richer, so the inequalities will rise. But this is a theory, and this theory is not it's not deterministic. This can change. So when we look at the real data, how these things evolve throughout the years, we can track how the per capita GDP was impacted the market Gini across the years in many economies. So the green line here is, for example, the Republic of Korea. So we can see that as the country was developing and the income was rising, actually the inequalities were still held at a very low level, and then only have risen somehow in the later years. Let's look at, for India, in other countries. So this is this example. So here we can see that as the economy was developing, inequalities were rising almost proportionally. So this means that depending on how the country develops the policies, how it distributes the wealth through the education accessibility, through the healthcare, through the social protection, it all has tremendous impact on how the inequalities are shaped long term. And indeed, when we see how this, on the other side of the coin, you can think that you can redistribute the wealth. But actually redistribution of the wealth, for example, through the social transfers, it works really well, but mostly in developed economies. And when you compare this to developing economies, because of the different institutional structure, like lots of informality, this redistribution is actually way less important than this whole pre-distribution. So how the economy is built and shaped in a long term, if there is universal healthcare or not, if there is universal access to education or not. So this matters in the long term even more. So in this way, we need to think on how to mobilize these strategic sectors to shape the economy in a way that will be inclusive for low-income households, to strengthen the labor's position and empower the labor so that the difference between the capital income and labor income is not as huge as now. And finally, boiling down again to the social protection, supporting for a lifelong training, being flexible and utilizing the technological changes. And finally, we're moving now to the most innovative and still under consideration policies. We have to think how the monetary policy can impact inequalities, because from the fiscal side and long-term fiscal impact, it's more natural, and we feel that it's been done for years. But there is also the monetary policy side, which can be more inclusive. So making things straight, of course, the most important part of the monetary policy is to ensure that there is inflation stability. So what we see now as an inflation is the primary target always for the central bank's monetary policy. But we can also think on how these various monetary policies impact income and wealth distribution. The change in interest rates does not impact the same poor and richer households. The same is for official reserve management. Maybe there are ways of how to allocate these reserves in a more productive way, that this can contribute to social change, for example, through social bonds. Finally, we have the currency issuance. So now there is a discussion on how to create, deploy the central bank digital currencies. And these currencies can have features which improve access to finance, improve financial literacy, which is still missing at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And finally, there is the financial regulation. So looking at what the central bank policies, there must be increased understanding on how to create these policies that they have this pro-social financial angle in mind. So not just focusing purely on inflation, which of course is still the priority, but going this extra mile to make pro-inclusive changes to increase the financial support. So regarding the key takeaways from this survey and presentation, designing the policies, both fiscal and monetary, inclusion should be in mind. Then the efficiency and the impact. So not all spending is equal, so we need to spend smart. Expansion of domestic revenues. So the tax base in general in the region is very low because of the avoidance of tax and also because of the informality. There are many ways to improve it, and digital technologies actually will come with a help here. Target them active opportunities for the transformation, not just focusing on innovation, but also on the ways that can promote job-rich transformation so that people at all levels of education experience can find their jobs. Finally, the inclusive central banking. This is one of the most new parts which has to be thought through and tried by trial and error and implemented, and to redesign these monetary policies to promote inclusiveness and promote financial inclusion. Thank you very much. This would be all, and I think we can move back to Sheila. Thank you very much.